Ladies and gentlemen, as we heard earlier at the outset of the debate this evening, the American journalist and essayist H.L. Mencken had very firm views on the relationship between the journalist and the politician when he said that it was akin to that of a dog to a lamppost. And that's probably what it feels like for a minister who might start the day being skewered by John Humphreys in the Today studio and ends it by being stuffed by Jeremy Paxman in the Newsnight studio, and they've probably gone via Channel 4 News and had their very own experience of the opposition's Michael Crick in between. And it's true that what came out very clearly in the Leveson inquiry is that the relationship between politicians and the press had become far too close in many instances, and we saw very clearly how ministers and MPs were too craven to take on newspaper interests, and Prime Minister after Prime Minister kowtowed to the owners and editors of national newspapers, meeting them for drinks and in gentlemen's clubs, hacking across the Oxfordshire countryside on an ex-police horse with Rupert Murdoch's closest henchwoman in the form of Rebecca Brooks. And yes, Tony Blair famously did travel to the other side of the globe to suck up to Rupert Murdoch, but he ended his days far less compliant, turning on those he'd like to think of as his media allies when he famously referred to the press as feral beasts. And Edmund Burke said that there were 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder, he said, there sat a 4th estate, more important by far than they all. And that separateness and that distance is truly vital in a democracy. And tonight's motion is a statement about the power relationship between British politics and the media. But if we look at where the power lies and who is in whose pocket, it isn't as straightforward as the proposers might like you to believe. And as General Secretary of the National Union of Journalists, I'd like to make a very important distinction between the working journalist and the owners and the editors. And sometimes a free press can mean the freedom for whoever owns the newspaper or the TV station to express their political views and prejudices. And I speak as somebody who worked at the Sunday Express and has had many, many experiences of what it's like to work for Richard Desmond, who's a particular type of interfering media proprietor. But media owners often share a common purpose with the political and powerful business elites. It isn't a matter of anyone being in anyone else's pocket, it's a matter of shared interests and power interests and corporate interests. And journalists, good journalists and all journalists rail against this. This is part of our function as journalists in a democratic society. And it's why, as the date gets closer to the publication of Lord Justice Leveson's report, the media barons and the editors are appealing to the Prime Minister and desperately lobbying, as we speak, to maintain the status quo with a slightly beefed up version of the Press Complaints Commission. The NUJ, however, is calling for proper independent regulation, which is not the same old boys club, which has failed the public before and failed quality journalism and will fail it again. We're arguing for a new body independent of the industry and Parliament, which comprises a broader representation, including the broader public, as well as journalists, as well as, of course, the industry and the editors. And let's not forget that the hacking scandal which led to the Leveson inquiry, came about and was uncovered and brought to everybody's attention because of being exposed by fearless investigative journalism. And that's something that we need more of. And it's true to say it's become something of an endangered species in the UK, but that's not because of British politics being in the pocket of the media. That's because of economic reasons. It's because many of our newspapers are starved of resources, and some of the bread and butter journalistic tasks like covering council meetings or uncovering wrongdoing is not happening because there aren't the bums on seats to be able to do it. It's because there aren't enough journalists there carrying out that work. It's not because they're coming under pressure or they're kowtowing to the interests of anybody else. And I would expect my members, who all sign up to the NUJ's Code of Conduct when they join the union, to have empty pockets. And I don't mean because of the poor pay that far too many of them receive for their job. It's about them having that healthy and robust distance from power, whether it's from politicians, whether it's from corporate interests, or whether it's from our police. And journalism was born out of dissent. Since the printed press was invented, there have been journalists bent on taking on the government of the day. And most of our members want to become journalists because they want to hold politicians and power to account. They want to get to the truth. New Labour famously thought that it can control journalists by offering favoured hacks and publications, leaks and advances, and banishing those that wouldn't toe the line into the land of no exclusives. But in the end, they too were bitten by the feral beasts. And the day that journalists feel that they've got politicians completely in their pockets would be the day that our fourth estate morphs into tamed pooches. Yes, journalists and politicians may get close, and after all, they share the same minority interest of politics. And all too often, sadly, they're drawn from the same narrow social pool, probably going to the same university. A recent Cabinet Office report said that the media had become one of the most socially exclusive professions, something that has really got to change. But for a journalist who is doing his or her job properly, it's all about serving the community, national or local, and not the vested powers. And it's interesting how certain MPs and certain newspapers, I think politicians are afraid of journalists and are afraid of what they're doing being uncovered. But there's a healthy fear that has to exist. In any democratic society, there needs to be that tussle, that distance, that robustness in the relationship. It's not about somebody being in somebody's pocket. It's about having that robust space and that distance to enable journalists to do their jobs properly. And what we see at the moment with the Jimmy Savile scandal, and you can see the impact that that's had on the BBC, it's interesting how that is being used as an opportunity by some politicians and by some newspapers indeed to attack the institution of the BBC, which is by no means perfect, far from it. But as part of its charter, as our public service broadcaster, the BBC has to ensure that its pockets are well and truly sewn up. It's that kind of independence that politicians don't like, and it's something that we have to preserve and cherish, because we know that unlike, rather than what the motion might imply, the media is not one homogenous lump. It's made up of many different entities throughout the UK. And that's why, despite having many views in common with some of my colleagues proposing this motion, indeed we sit on many of the same platforms when we talk about Leveson and the vital need for change in our regulatory system, I'm opposing very strongly the notion that British politics is in the pocket of the media. And of course, there's another very straightforward reason why it's absolutely not in the pockets of journalists, namely that there are far too many other more attractive options for our politicians, not least the fur-lined pockets belonging to business and other powerful interest lobbies. Perhaps one of the most illustrative examples of the relationship between press and politicians that came out of the Leveson Enquiry were the sycophantic text messages between Rebecca Brooks and David Cameron. A great example of the coziness that had been allowed to proliferate. But who was in whose pocket? If you scratch through the polished veneer of the friendship, the cosy dinners, the horse riding, the air kisses, in actual fact, this is a relationship more akin to a game, playing out between two people similarly and absolutely out for their own interests, each playing to their own rules. Rebecca said in one of her texts that she was so rooting for David. Her Prime Minister signed off his text message with lol, thinking rather sweetly that it meant lots of love. But as Ms. Brooks seemed very pleased to point out at the Leveson Enquiry, the abbreviation, of course, obviously means laugh out loud. And I think that's an example of one joke that's been most definitely been on her Cotswold neighbour. But I think this motion does not in any way reflect the complexities of the relationship between politics and between journalism and the media, which is not one homogenous lump. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would urge you to oppose this motion very strongly this evening. Thank you.